Have you ever thought about the stories that slip through the cracks of history? The ones people whisper about once and then deliberately forget because remembering them feels dangerous. This is one of those stories. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to know where all of you are scattered around the globe, especially before we dig into something this disturbing. We're going back to 1847, deep into the Appalachian backcountry, where the ridges held onto their mysteries and the forests could swallow a person whole without leaving a trace. This was an era when someone could vanish completely, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions that would haunt the living for generations. These mountains weren't just far from civilization. They operated by different rules entirely, where the thin veneer of society could crack under the pressure of complete isolation and unimaginable darkness. Our focus lands on a stretch of wilderness that would eventually become part of eastern Kentucky. This particular section was so choked with mountain laurel and carved up by steep ravines that even the Cherokee people who'd once lived there avoided it deliberately. They had their reasons, and the white settlers who came later would discover exactly what those reasons were, though the lesson would come at a terrible cost. A trapper named Silas Merrick worked this territory. He was 38 years old, built lean and wiry from decades of surviving in conditions that would break most men. He stood just shy of 6 feet, but something about the way he carried himself made him seem taller, the way certain men do when they're absolutely confident in their environment. His face was all hard angles and deep-set eyes the color of creek water after a storm, that murky gray-green that you couldn't read no matter how hard you tried. His hands were a road map of his life, covered in scars and calluses from years of setting steel traps and skinning carcasses, with 2 fingers on his left hand bent at odd angles from breaks that had never been set properly. Silas kept his hair long like most mountain men did, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was perpetually unkempt, streaked with gray despite him not being particularly old. He dressed in buckskin, he'd tanned himself, patched over and over, until you couldn't tell what was original material and what was repair work. The scattered families living down in the valleys knew him as a solitary figure, a man who came down from the high country maybe 3 times a year to trade his pelts and buy the few supplies he couldn't make or trap himself. People called him peculiar, but harmless, the way folks always describe loners they don't understand, but haven't been given a concrete reason to fear. What set Silas apart from other trappers working these mountains was how deep he went into the backcountry and how long he stayed there. Most men ran a circuit that brought them back to some form of civilization every few weeks at minimum. Silas would disappear into the high elevations for months at a stretch, only emerging when the seasons changed or his supplies ran dangerously low. He maintained a primary cabin somewhere deep in the mountains, though nobody could say exactly where, plus a network of smaller camps scattered throughout his territory. He knew these ridges better than any living soul, every game trail and water source, every cave and cliff face and hidden hollow. That intimate knowledge made him the most successful trapper in the entire region. It also made him something else, something that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The closest settlement to Silas's territory was a place called Harlan's Creek, a collection of maybe 20 families scattered along a valley where the land flattened out enough for farming. It wasn't much of a town by any standard, just a general store, a small church, and a scattering of log cabins. But it served as the center of what passed for community in that part of the mountains. The man who ran the general store was named Josiah Peyton, 42 years old and thick around the middle from years of easier living compared to his customers. Josiah had a round, usually pleasant face, the kind of man who smiled readily and seemed to know everyone's business without appearing to pry too hard. He ran the store with his wife Prudence, a capable woman who was really the driving force behind their modest success. Josiah had known Silas for years, had been trading with him since the trapper first appeared in the region back in 1839, and he'd always found him fair in his dealings. if somewhat odd in his manner. It was Josiah who first noticed something had changed. This happened in late October of 1847, when Silas came down from the mountains earlier than usual, with fewer furs than expected. The trapper seemed agitated, constantly glancing over his shoulder and startling at sounds Josiah couldn't hear. When Josiah asked if everything was all right up in the high country, Silas had given him a look that was impossible to interpret, something hovering between fear and excitement, and said the mountains were teaching him new things. He bought his usual supplies, salt, coffee, and lead for bullets. But he also purchased rope, an unusual amount of it, plus several items that seemed completely out of place for a man living alone in the wilderness. When Josiah mentioned the odd purchases, Silas had smiled in a way that never touched his eyes and said a man needed to be ready for opportunities when they presented themselves. Then he loaded everything onto his pack mule and headed back up into the mountains without another word. That conversation stuck with Josiah, nagged at him in a way he couldn't articulate. He mentioned it to Prudence that evening, and she'd given him that look she had, the one that said she'd been thinking the exact same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. They agreed there was something off about Silas's demeanor. But what could they do? A man had a right to be strange if that's what he wanted, and buying rope wasn't a crime. So they filed it away mentally and went about their business the way people do when they sense something wrong but can't justify acting on that instinct. Winter arrived early that year, with snow falling in the high country by the first week of November. The trappers who worked the lower elevations started coming down to wait out the worst of the cold. But Silas stayed up in his territory. That wasn't unusual in itself. He'd weathered plenty of mountain winters alone. But combined with his strange behavior in October, it gave Josiah an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. December passed, then January, and the settlement at Harlan's Creek huddled against the cold and waited for spring like they did every year. It was during this period that people started disappearing, though nobody connected the vanishings right away because the missing were drifters and wanderers, the kind of people whose absence might not be noticed for weeks or even months. The first was a traveling preacher named Amos Whitfield, a man of perhaps 55 years, who made a circuit through the mountain settlements, bringing what he called the good word to the scattered faithful. He was thin, almost gaunt, with wild gray hair and eyes that burned with the intensity of his calling. Amos had passed through Harlan's Creek in early December, delivered a rousing sermon in the little church, then headed up into the mountains to reach the more isolated families before heavy snows made travel impossible. He never arrived at any of them. When spring came, and Amos didn't appear on his usual circuit, people assumed he'd taken ill somewhere, or perhaps decided to winter over with one of the families he visited. It wasn't until much later that anyone thought to actually worry. The second disappearance involved a fur buyer named Vernon Lattimore, a stocky man of 43 with a round red face and a jovial manner that made him popular with the trappers whose pelts he purchased. Vernon made his living traveling from settlement to settlement, buying furs and then selling them at a profit in the larger towns to the east. He'd come through Harlan's Creek in late January during a brief thaw, asking if anyone had seen Silas Merrick because he'd heard the man had some premium fox pelts. Josiah told him that Silas was up in the high country and probably wouldn't come down until the spring thaw. But Vernon was insistent. He said he'd paid good money for information about those fox pelts, and he wasn't leaving without at least trying to find them. Josiah tried to talk him out of it, warned him the high country was no place for a man who didn't know it during winter, but Vernon was stubborn, and he had a good mule and plenty of supplies. He headed up the mountain trail that led in the general direction of Silas's territory, and that was the last anyone saw of him. By the time spring arrived in full, 3 more people had vanished. There was Clyde Morrison, a young trapper of 26, who decided to try his luck in the high country despite warnings from more experienced men. There was a wandering tinker named Horace, no one knew his last name, who fixed pots and pans and sold small necessities to isolated families. And there was a woman named Opal Hutchins, 34 years old, who'd been traveling to meet her sister's family after her husband died of fever. 5 people, all of them last seen heading up into the mountains during winter. None of them arriving where they were supposed to go. It was Prudence Peyton who first suggested that maybe these disappearances weren't just bad luck or accidents. She'd been keeping a kind of informal record, the way shopkeepers do, noting when people passed through and what they said they were planning. When she laid it all out for Josiah in early April, showing him her notes and the dates and the common thread of all of them heading into the high country, he felt his stomach go cold. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to say it was just coincidence, but Prudence gave him that look again, and he knew she was right to be concerned. And now that we're here, this story is being narrated by The Fear Behind You. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to the channel. Oh, and if you're hearing this on another channel, know that they stole our content without permission. Report them for us. The question became, what to do about it? They couldn't exactly form a search party for people who might have just changed their plans or met with accidents. The mountains were dangerous in winter, and people died in them. That was just a fact of life in that time and place. But 5 people seemed like too many to be pure chance. Josiah decided to wait until Silas came down from the mountains for his spring trading and ask him if he'd seen or heard anything unusual. It seemed like the reasonable approach, and Silas knew those mountains better than anyone. If something strange was happening up there, surely he would have noticed. Silas appeared in Harlan's Creek during the 3rd week of April, emerging from the mountain trail just after dawn, with his pack mule loaded with more furs than Josiah had ever seen him bring down at once. There were fox and beaver, even a few prime marten pelts, all of them expertly skinned and prepared. Silas himself looked different, though, leaner somehow despite the successful trapping season, and there was something in his eyes that made Josiah uncomfortable in a way he couldn't define. The trapper seemed energized, almost manic, talking more than he usually did about the hard winter and the good trapping and how the mountains had been generous to him. When Josiah brought up the missing people, trying to sound casual about it, Silas's entire demeanor changed. He went very still, like a deer that's caught a scent, and his eyes focused on Josiah with an intensity that made the storekeeper wish he'd kept his mouth shut. Silas said he hadn't seen anyone all winter, which was normal for him, and that the high country was dangerous for people who didn't know it. He said it in a way that felt like a warning, though whether he was warning about the mountains themselves or about asking questions, Josiah couldn't say. Then Silas gathered up his supplies, took his payment for the furs, and headed back up into the mountains without his usual lingering to hear settlement gossip. Josiah watched him go with a knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with breakfast. Over the next few weeks, he found himself unable to shake his unease. He talked to Prudence about it constantly, going over every detail of his interaction with Silas, trying to understand what bothered him so much. It wasn't anything the trapper had said exactly, more the way he'd said it, the way he'd changed when the missing people were mentioned. Prudence suggested they might want to mention their concerns to someone with authority, but who would that be? The nearest thing they had to law enforcement was a circuit judge who came through twice a year, and he wouldn't be back until autumn. They couldn't exactly ride to the county seat with nothing but a feeling and expect anyone to take them seriously. The decision was made for them in early May, when a young man named Gideon Cross came stumbling into Harlan's Creek half dead from exposure and terror. Gideon was 23 years old, tall and rangy, with the kind of build that suggested he'd grow into a powerful man if he lived long enough. He'd gone up into the mountains 3 weeks earlier, hoping to do some late spring trapping before the season ended completely. What he found instead would change everything, though on that day in May he could barely speak through his shock and exhaustion. Josiah and Prudence took Gideon into their home, fed him, gave him a place to rest, and slowly coaxed the story out of him. He'd been working a creek valley about 2 days' travel into the high country, setting his traps and checking them, according to the patterns his father had taught him. On the third day, he'd come across something that made every instinct scream at him to run. It was a camp, or what remained of one, tucked into a hollow between two ridges. The camp itself wasn't unusual. Trappers made temporary camps all the time, but what was scattered around it made Gideon's blood run cold. There were signs that something terrible had happened there. Personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to any single person. A tinker's case lying open and empty. A preacher's Bible with its pages swollen from moisture. A woman's traveling bag with its contents strewn about as if someone had searched through them and discarded what they didn't want. All of it just abandoned there, left to the elements. And there were marks on the trees, strange carvings that looked almost like tallies, as if someone had been keeping count of something. But what really terrified Gideon was the realization of what he wasn't seeing. Where were the people who owned these things? The mountains were dangerous, yes, but when someone died in the wilderness, their body was usually found eventually, or at least there were signs of what had happened. Here, there was nothing but belongings, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd run then, abandoned his own gear and traps and run for 2 days straight, barely stopping to rest, driven by a terror so profound it overrode exhaustion and hunger and every other physical need. Josiah listened to all of this with growing horror, and when Gideon finished, he had to ask the question they were all thinking. Did Gideon know whose camp it was? The young man shook his head at first, said there were no obvious markings. But then he remembered something. There had been a mule, a pack mule, hobbled near the camp. It was a distinctive animal. One ear cropped short from some old injury. Josiah felt the blood drain from his face because he knew that mule. Everyone who traded with Silas Merrick knew that mule. What do you do when you realize that someone you've known for years, someone you've traded with and talked to and thought you understood, might be responsible for something unspeakable? Josiah wrestled with that question for days. Part of him wanted to dismiss Gideon's story, to find some other explanation, but he couldn't. Too many pieces fit together. Silas's strange behavior, the missing people, the camp with its disturbing evidence, and the mule that could only belong to one man. But wanting to believe something and being able to prove it were two different things, and Josiah knew that making accusations without proof could be dangerous, especially when those accusations were aimed at a man who lived by his wits in the wilderness and knew 100 ways to make someone disappear. In the end, it was Prudence who made the decision. She said they had a moral obligation to do something, even if it put them at risk, because if they were right and they did nothing, then they were complicit in whatever happened next. She proposed they gather a group of men, armed and prepared, and go up into the high country to investigate the camp Gideon had described. If they found evidence of wrongdoing, they'd bring it back to the settlement and send for proper authorities. If they found nothing, or if there was some innocent explanation, then they'd have peace of mind and owe Silas an apology. It was a reasonable plan, as reasonable as anything could be under the circumstances, and after much discussion, Josiah agreed to it. Gathering men for the expedition proved more difficult than expected. Most of the trappers and farmers in the area were busy with spring planting or their own trapping, and when Josiah explained why he needed them, many were reluctant to get involved. Silas Merrick was a known quantity in the mountains, and people who lived in isolated areas understood the importance of not making enemies unnecessarily. But Gideon's story had spread the way such stories always do, and there were enough men who felt the same moral obligation Prudence had articulated that eventually a group of 7 was assembled. There was Josiah himself, who felt responsible since he'd been the one to first voice concerns about the missing people. There was Gideon, who insisted on going despite his trauma because he knew where the camp was. There was a farmer named Luther Grimes, a solid man of 50 with a steady hand and a practical mind. There were two brothers, Ephraim and Mordecai Keene, both experienced hunters who knew the mountains almost as well as Silas did. There was a blacksmith named Amos Carr, young and strong and eager to prove himself. And there was a former soldier named Hiram Dalton, 61 years old but still capable, who'd seen combat in the War of 1812 and knew how to handle himself in dangerous situations. They set out on the 15th of May, loaded with supplies for a week-long journey and armed with rifles and knives. The plan was to reach the camp Gideon had described, document what they found, and return to Harlan's Creek to decide on next steps. Nobody talked about what they'd do if they actually encountered Silas up there, though everyone had thought about it. Hiram, with his military experience, had quietly advised the others to be prepared for anything and to stay together at all times. The mountains could be unforgiving to the unwary, and if Silas was everything they feared he might be, then separating would be a fatal mistake. The journey up into the high country took 3 days of hard travel, following game trails and creek beds through country that grew increasingly remote and wild. Gideon led them, though his fear was palpable and grew stronger the closer they got to their destination. On the 3rd day, as they approached the ridge that overlooked the valley where he'd found the camp, he became so agitated that Hiram had to physically steady him and remind him to breathe. They proceeded with extreme caution from that point, moving quietly and checking their surroundings constantly for any sign of Silas or his mule. The camp was exactly where Gideon had said it would be, tucked into a hollow that was invisible from most angles and accessible only through a narrow defile between 2 rock faces. As they approached, something felt profoundly wrong about the place. The air seemed heavier somehow, and there was a smell that made several of the men cover their noses. They found the scattered belongings Gideon had described, more of them than he'd remembered in his panic, a collection of personal items that represented at least 6 different people. The lean-to shelter was still standing, and what they found inside made it clear that something terrible had happened in this place. Luther Grimes, who'd worked as a butcher before taking up farming, examined what was there with a professional eye and then had to step away. When he recovered, he confirmed what they'd all feared. Someone had been using this camp for purposes that had nothing to do with trapping or survival. The evidence was undeniable, though Luther refused to describe the specifics, saying only that no honest man would have such things in a wilderness camp. The missing people had been here, that much was certain, but where they were now was a question that filled everyone with dread. Ephraim Keene, who had been scouting the perimeter of the camp, called out that he'd found something. A trail, recently used, leading deeper into the mountains. It was a game trail mostly, but someone had been using it regularly enough to keep it clear and visible. Hiram made the decision that they should follow it, at least for a ways, to see where it led. If it took them to Silas's main cabin, they'd need to know its location to guide any authorities who might eventually come to investigate. If it led somewhere else, well, they needed to know that too. The trail wound through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing higher into the mountains and passing through thickets of laurel so dense they had to crawl through them in places. After about 2 miles, it opened into a narrow valley that looked like it had been hidden from the world since the mountains were young. There was a spring-fed creek running through it, and a small meadow where sunlight could reach the ground, and at the far end, built against the base of a cliff, was a cabin that was more substantial than anything they'd expected to find, this deep in the wilderness. The cabin was well made, built of chinked logs with a stone chimney, and what looked like a root cellar dug into the hillside beside it. There was a small barn or shed, and the mule they were looking for was there, along with 2 others that Silas must have acquired somehow. The whole setup spoke of permanence, of a man who had built himself a home in this remote place and intended to stay. But something about the place felt wrong in a way that went beyond its isolation. There were marks on the trees surrounding the cabin, strange symbols carved into the bark that none of them recognized, and hanging from branches near the cabin's entrance were objects that made their blood run cold when they got close enough to see what they were. They were talismans of some kind, crude and disturbing, fashioned from materials that shouldn't have been used for such purposes. The men didn't need to be told what they were looking at. The implications were clear and horrifying. Josiah felt his gorge rise and had to remind himself to keep breathing. This was worse than anything they'd imagined, suggesting not just violence, but something deliberate and methodical, a darkness that had been growing in this hidden valley for who knew how long. Hiram called them to a halt, and they crouched in the tree line, watching the cabin for signs of life. No smoke came from the chimney, and no movement was visible through the single window, but that didn't mean the place was empty. They waited for almost an hour, barely breathing, until Hiram was satisfied that if Silas was there, he wasn't showing himself. Then they approached in a line, weapons ready, every sense alert for danger. The cabin door was secured with a heavy bolt from the outside, which struck them all as odd. Why would someone bolt their own door from the outside unless they were keeping something in or trying to preserve something they didn't want disturbed? Hiram and Ephraim positioned themselves on either side while Mordecai lifted the bolt as quietly as he could. Then Hiram kicked the door open and they all stepped back, expecting something to rush out or someone to emerge. Instead, there was only silence and that smell again, stronger now, so strong it made their eyes water. Luther, being the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, entered first with his rifle raised. The others followed, and what they found inside that cabin would haunt every one of them for the rest of their lives. The main room was organized like a workshop, but the purpose of that workshop was something no honest person would pursue. There were shelves lining the walls, and what those shelves contained made Josiah's head swim with horror and incomprehension. The specifics don't need to be repeated here, but Luther, with his butcher's knowledge, confirmed that the missing people had ended up in this cabin, and what had happened to them was beyond anything civilized people could imagine. There were also books, journals filled with writing in a neat hand, documenting things that should never have been documented. Silas had been keeping records of his activities with the detached precision of someone conducting research, as if what he was doing was a form of study rather than a series of crimes against humanity. The journals revealed a mind that had descended into a kind of madness that was all the more terrifying for being methodical and organized. But it was what they found in the root cellar that pushed several of the men past their breaking point. Amos Carr, the young blacksmith, opened the cellar door and immediately collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him. Mordecai helped him up and looked inside, then turned away with his hand over his mouth. In the end, only Hiram and Luther had the stomach to verify what was there. The evidence was undeniable. At least 9 people had met their end in this hidden valley, and the manner of their passing was something that would give these men nightmares for the rest of their lives. Have you ever felt like you stumbled onto something you weren't meant to see? Something so wrong that your mind rejects it even as you're looking at it? Leave a comment if you've ever encountered something that made you question what humans are capable of. As the men stood in that cabin trying to process what they'd discovered, they heard something outside, a sound that might have been the wind, or might have been something else. Hiram immediately ordered everyone to get out of the cabin and take up defensive positions. They didn't know where Silas was. He could be miles away checking his trap lines, or he could be watching them from the tree line. Either way, they'd just violated his home and discovered his secrets. And if he appeared now, they had every reason to believe he'd try to stop them from leaving with that knowledge. They positioned themselves in a defensive circle around the cabin, using trees and rocks for cover, and waited. The forest around them seemed to press in, every shadow potentially hiding a threat. An hour passed, then 2, and still there was no sign of Silas. Hiram made the decision that they needed to move, to get out of this valley and back toward Harlan's Creek while they still had daylight. They could return with more men, with proper authority. But staying here in the dark was asking to be picked off one by a man who knew this terrain better than any of them. They moved quickly but carefully, retracing their steps through the laurel thickets and down the game trail. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Gideon was shaking so badly that Ephraim had to help him walk, and young Amos Carr had gone pale and silent after what he'd seen. They made it back to the disturbing camp, where they'd first found evidence of Silas's activities, and paused there briefly to catch their breath and decide on their route back to the settlement. It was Mordecai who saw him first, or thought he saw him, a figure standing motionless on a ridge about 300 yards distant. He pointed it out to the others, and they all looked. But by the time their eyes found the spot, the figure was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Hiram said it didn't matter whether they'd really seen Silas or just imagined it. They needed to move now and move fast. They gathered their gear and headed down the mountain at a pace that was just short of running, no longer caring about noise or stealth, but only about putting distance between themselves and that hidden valley. They traveled through the night, something none of them would normally attempt in mountain country. But the alternative, making camp and trying to sleep with Silas potentially hunting them, seemed infinitely worse. By dawn, they were exhausted and strung out, their nerves shot and their muscles trembling from the combination of exertion and fear. They paused to rest and eat, taking turns keeping watch, and as the sun rose higher, they saw smoke rising from somewhere up the mountain behind them. Not campfire smoke, but a large fire, something burning with intensity and purpose. Luther, looking through a small telescope he'd brought for scouting, reported that it looked like the cabin was burning. All of them understood what that meant. Silas had returned to find his home violated, his secrets exposed, and he'd destroyed the evidence. Everything they'd seen, all the proof of what he'd done, was going up in smoke. They pushed on, fear giving them energy they didn't know they had, and by afternoon of the second day, they stumbled into Harlan's Creek, filthy and exhausted, but alive. The story they told caused an uproar in the settlement and in the surrounding region when word spread. A group of men was quickly organized to return to the mountains, led by a deputy sheriff who had ridden in from the county seat. But when they reached the hidden valley, they found exactly what the first expedition had reported, seeing from a distance. The cabin was burned to the ground, nothing but charred logs and ash remaining. The root cellar had been collapsed. The camp where Gideon had first discovered the disturbing evidence had been similarly destroyed, anything useful removed or burned. They found Silas's mule dead near the burned cabin. The other 2 mules were gone. Tracks suggested that someone, presumably Silas, had loaded supplies on them and headed deeper into the mountains, traveling west toward territory that was even more remote than the valley they were searching. The deputy organized a pursuit, but the trail disappeared into rocky terrain where even expert trackers couldn't follow it, and after 3 days of fruitless searching in increasingly wild country, they had to admit defeat. Silas Merrick was never found, never apprehended, never brought to justice for what he'd done. He vanished into the wilderness that had been his home and his hunting ground, and despite periodic searches over the following years, no trace of him was ever discovered. The men who'd found his cabin and seen the evidence of his crimes were left to carry that knowledge, to live with what they'd witnessed, and to wonder whether Silas was still out there somewhere, still pursuing his dark purposes in some even more remote location. The settlements in that region changed after the story spread. People became more cautious about traveling alone through the mountains, more aware that the isolation they'd always accepted as part of life in the wilderness could hide dangers more terrible than wild animals or harsh weather. Several families moved away entirely, unwilling to live in the shadow of such knowledge. The church in Harlan's Creek held special services to pray for those who'd been lost, and to ask for protection from similar evil. But prayers couldn't change what had happened, or bring back the missing or guarantee that something similar wouldn't happen again. Josiah Peyton never fully recovered from the experience. He continued to run his store, continued his life in Harlan's Creek, but Prudence said he was never quite the same after seeing what he'd seen in that cabin. He developed a habit of watching the mountain trails, especially as evening fell, as if expecting Silas to emerge from the wilderness at any moment. He slept poorly and startled at unexpected sounds. The easy smile that had characterized him before was gone, replaced by a weariness that suggested he'd learned things about human nature that he wished he could unlearn. Gideon Cross left the mountains entirely, moved east to more settled country where the wilderness was tamed and neighbors were close enough to call for help if needed. He married eventually and started a life far from those peaks, but he never spoke about what he'd found in those mountains. The only evidence that the experience had marked him was his absolute refusal to ever travel through wild country again, and a recurring nightmare that would wake him at odd hours. Luther Grimes struggled with what he'd seen, the knowledge weighing on him in ways that affected his health and spirit. The Keene brothers, Ephraim and Mordecai, kept trapping, but never ventured into the high country again, working only the lower elevations, where they were never more than a day's travel from settlement. Young Amos Carr eventually moved to a growing town, where he could lose himself in crowds and the noise of civilization. Only Hiram Dalton seemed to weather the experience without visible trauma. But then, he'd seen terrible things in war, and perhaps he'd already learned how to carry such knowledge without letting it break him. The official records from that time are sparse and unhelpful. There was no trial, no formal documentation of Silas's crimes, because there was no one to charge, and the evidence had been destroyed. The deputy wrote a report describing what they'd found and sent it to the county seat, but it was filed away and largely forgotten. In those days, with so much wilderness and so little formal law enforcement, such things could happen and leave barely a ripple in the historical record. What remains are the stories, the oral histories passed down through families and communities, growing and changing with each telling, but maintaining a core of truth about what happened in those mountains in 1847. There were occasional reports over the years that followed, rumors and possible sightings that might or might not have been Silas. A trapper working in the mountains of Western Virginia in 1853 reported finding a camp that filled him with such dread he abandoned his entire season's work and fled. A family traveling through the Cumberland Gap in 1857 disappeared without a trace, their wagon found with all their belongings, but no sign of the people themselves. A hunter in the mountains of Tennessee in 1862 claimed he'd been followed for 3 days by someone who never showed themselves, but whose presence was unmistakable. He escaped only by joining up with a larger group of men. Were any of these incidents connected to Silas Merrick? There's no way to know for certain. The man would have been in his 60s by the time of the last reported incident, aged but not impossibly so for someone who'd lived his entire life in the wilderness. Or perhaps these were different threats, other people who discovered that isolation could hide terrible secrets. Either way, the stories served a purpose, keeping people cautious and aware that the wilderness held dangers beyond those that could be explained by nature alone. The hidden valley where Silas had built his cabin became a place that people avoided, even those who didn't know its history. Trappers working the region reported feeling uneasy there, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. Some claimed to hear sounds that didn't belong, or to experience an inexplicable sense of wrongness in certain locations. Whether these experiences were real, or the product of knowing the valley's dark history, is impossible to say. But the effect was the same. The valley remained empty, the cabin's ruins gradually being reclaimed by the forest, and the memories of what had happened there fading into legend. There's a question that haunts everyone who hears this story, a question that the men who found Silas's cabin struggled with for the rest of their lives. How does a person become what Silas Merrick became? Was there something in him from the beginning, some fundamental wrongness that the isolation of the mountains allowed to grow? Or did the isolation itself create the darkness, the years of solitude gradually eroding whatever moral constraints he might have once possessed? The journals, before they burned, suggested someone who'd convinced himself that what he was doing served some higher purpose. But that rationalization had to come from somewhere, had to be built on a foundation of earlier choices that led eventually to the horror of that cabin. We want to believe that such evil is always obvious, that we'd recognize a person like Silas Merrick before they could do harm. But Josiah had known him for years, had traded with him and talked with him, and found him to be fair in his dealings, if unusual in his manner. Other trappers had encountered him on the trails and found him to be knowledgeable and even helpful. The families in the scattered settlements had accepted him as part of the landscape, a solitary man who preferred the wilderness but who wasn't considered a threat. And all of that while he was doing unspeakable things in his hidden valley, maintaining two completely separate existences without anyone suspecting the truth. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole story, the realization that such people don't always announce themselves. They can walk among us, can participate in the normal rhythms of community life, can seem unremarkable or even admirable in certain ways, all while harboring secrets that would horrify anyone who discovered them. Silas Merrick was successful as a trapper because he understood his environment, because he was patient and methodical and capable of thinking ahead. Those same qualities made him devastatingly effective as a predator of human beings, able to identify vulnerable targets and create situations where he could take them without raising immediate alarm. The victims he chose were telling in their own way. All of them were people traveling alone who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared, who had reasons to be in the mountains, and whose absence could be explained by accident or misfortune. Vernon Lattimore was pursuing what he thought was a business opportunity. Amos Whitfield was bringing his ministry to isolated families. Opal Hutchins was traveling to join her sister. The others were similarly vulnerable people who'd made the mistake of being alone in country, where Silas had every advantage. The historical record is silent on most of this. You won't find Silas Merrick's name in the history books or read about his crimes in accounts of that era. This is one of those stories that exists in the gaps, in the spaces between official documentation, preserved only through oral tradition and the traumatic memories of the men who discovered what he'd done. In some ways, that makes it more powerful than a documented crime, because it reminds us how much history is lost or deliberately forgotten, especially when that history involves events we'd rather not confront. There's a tendency to think of the past as being simpler than the present, more innocent somehow, but stories like this one remind us that human darkness is not a modern invention. Silas Merrick was doing in 1847 what predators have done throughout human history, exploiting isolation and social disconnection to harm others. The specific details change with time and technology, but the fundamental patterns remain consistent. There have always been people who view others as objects to be used, and there have always been situations where such people can operate until chance or careful observation exposes them. The men who found Silas's cabin and survived were changed by the experience in ways both obvious and subtle. They carried the knowledge of what humans are capable of, the understanding that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe. That knowledge is a burden, one that colors every subsequent interaction and makes it harder to trust in the basic goodness of humanity. But they went on with their lives, because that's what people do. They carried their trauma, and they participated in their communities, and they raised their families, and eventually they died, taking their first-hand memories of Silas Merrick with them. What remains is the story, passed down through generations, altered in some retellings, but maintaining its essential truth about what happened in those mountains and what it revealed about human nature. The question of what happened to Silas himself has never been answered. Did he continue in some other location? Did he die in the wilderness? Or did he somehow integrate himself into another community, once again becoming the odd but seemingly harmless loner? There's no way to know, and perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Such people are more terrifying when they remain undefined, when they could be anywhere, when they remind us that the person we think we know might harbor secrets we can't imagine. The mountains where all of this occurred are still there, still remote and wild despite the passage of time. The hidden valley where his cabin stood has been reclaimed by nature, and if you didn't know where to look or what had happened there, you'd find it just another beautiful spot in the wilderness. The trails he walked are still there, used now by people who have no idea of the history beneath their feet. The settlements he visited have grown or disappeared, and everyone who knew him has been gone for generations. But the story persists, as such stories always do, because we need them. We need to be reminded that evil is real, and that it often wears an ordinary face. We need to remember that isolation can hide terrible secrets. We need to understand that the absence of oversight creates opportunities for those with dark intentions, and we need to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that someone like Silas Merrick was once a person living in society, someone who had experiences and made choices that led him down a path that ended with a cabin full of secrets too dark to fully describe. The families of his victims never got closure. They never recovered those they'd lost, never saw justice done in any formal sense. All they had were the testimonies of the men who'd found the evidence and the knowledge that their loved ones had met a fate too terrible to fully contemplate. That kind of loss, that kind of not knowing combined with knowing just enough, leaves scars that never fully heal. It echoes down through generations, becoming trauma that shapes how people view the world and assess risk and trust in others. And perhaps that's the real horror of the story. Not the specific acts Silas committed, but what those acts revealed about the fragility of safety. We rely on the assumption that most people won't hurt us, that there are limits beyond which civilized humans won't go. Silas Merrick demonstrated that those assumptions can be wrong, that we're only safe because most people choose to respect the boundaries of civilized behavior, and that choice can be unmade. As the years passed, and the generation that had lived through these events died off, the story of Silas Merrick became more legend than history. Details were added or subtracted, the specifics grew vaguer, and the character of Silas himself was transformed into something more archetypal, less human. He became the mountain trapper, a figure of folklore used to illustrate the dangers of isolation and the darkness that can grow when people are removed from the moderating influence of society. But underneath the legend is the reality, the truth of what happened in 1847 in those mountains, the lives that were lost, and the families that were shattered, and the men who discovered the truth and had to carry that knowledge. Vernon Lattimore, who just wanted to buy some furs. Amos Whitfield, who wanted to bring comfort to isolated families. Opal Hutchins, who was trying to reach her sister. All of them encountered Silas Merrick in his element, and none of them survived. The story ends not with resolution, but with uncertainty. With Silas disappearing into the mountains and the communities he'd terrorized left to pick up the pieces. The men who'd discovered his secrets returned to their lives, changed. The families of the victims mourned without closure. The settlements in the region became more cautious, more aware. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, perhaps in a hidden valley no one has yet discovered, there might be evidence of what became of Silas Merrick. Or there might be nothing at all. So what do we take from a story like this? Perhaps it's simply to remember, to acknowledge that these things happened and that those who suffered deserve to be remembered, even if history has largely forgotten them. Perhaps it's to understand that human nature has depths we'd prefer not to contemplate, and that civilization is a choice we have to make constantly. Perhaps it's to recognize that the isolation we might romanticize created opportunities for those with dark intentions to operate without constraint. Or perhaps there's no grand lesson, Just a story about something terrible that happened long ago in mountains that are still wild, despite what they witnessed. A reminder that the past is full of horrors that never made it into the textbooks, that history is incomplete, and that the absence of documentation doesn't mean the absence of event. Silas Merrick existed. His victims existed. And what happened in that hidden valley in 1847 was real, even if most of the evidence burned and the details have been lost to time. The mountains where all of this occurred are still there, still drawing people who want to experience wilderness and solitude. People walk trails that might have been walked by Silas or his victims. They camp in valleys that might hide ruins or secrets. And occasionally, someone reports feeling watched in those mountains, or finding something that doesn't quite fit, or experiencing a sense of unease in a location that should be beautiful and peaceful. Whether these experiences connect to the past or are simply the normal sensations of being in wild places is impossible to say, but the stories persist, adding new layers to the legend. And you, listening to this story now, what do you make of it? Do you believe that such darkness can exist in a single person? Have you ever encountered something that made you question what humans are capable of? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this live on through the telling and the hearing, through the conversations they spark. We remember not to horrify, but to understand, to learn, and to remain aware of what can happen when darkness finds fertile ground. The fear behind you will continue to bring you these stories, the ones that don't make it into the official histories, the ones that persist in whispers and warnings. Stay with us for the next account. Until then, remember that the mountains keep their secrets, and not all of those secrets should be uncovered. Some things are buried for good reason, and some stories are told not to entertain, but to warn.